All right, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're taking a really hard look at the heavy and, honestly, kind of staggering costs of legacy enterprise data stacks. Look, for decades, the industry standard has basically been these massive, wildly expensive, always-on engines just to do some basic analytics. But today, we're deconstructing that whole idea. We're putting the traditional giant SAP DataSphere head-to-head with a nimble, highly efficient open-source alternative.
Okay, so let's just dive right into this. It all comes down to the ultimate billion-dollar question: can we actually eliminate expensive data warehouses for analytics? Like, can we just load data into cheap storage, slap a lightweight index on it, and totally bypass those heavy traditional databases? We're going to challenge the fundamental premise that SAP has been selling us for decades.
And right out of the gate, one of our source analysts puts it perfectly. They said, yes, you can. In fact, your thesis strikes directly at the fundamental flaw of legacy architectures like the SAP Business Data Cloud. I mean, that is a massive statement. Vendors have convinced enterprises that analytics absolutely require proprietary, always-on engines like SAP HANA. Well, we're going to bust that myth right now.
So here's our roadmap for breaking this all down today. First, we're covering the proprietary database myth. Second, the decoupled Duck Lake solution. Third, how we actually solve the database requirement. Fourth, the architectural cost shift. Fifth, an 85-15 reality check. And finally, we'll expose SAP's last real defense.
Let's start with part one, the proprietary database myth.
You know, there's this deeply ingrained industry belief that analytics require these heavy, always-running transactional databases. But the truth is, true OLAP, that's online analytical processing, doesn't actually need an expensive database engine sitting on top of proprietary storage just to hold static records. Think about it. Analytics is fundamentally about querying data, right? It's not about constantly running operational transactions. So the new reality is all about decoupling your storage from your compute, rather than paying top dollar for a tightly coupled engine that runs 24/7, even when you aren't using it.
Moving on to part two, the decoupled Duck Lake solution.
So, how does this nimble challenger architecture actually work in practice? Well, to get true OLAP without all that legacy baggage, you really only need three things. First up, cheap open bulk storage. We're talking about storing your analytical data as Apache Parquet files in standard cloud object storage, like Amazon S3, Google Cloud, or Azure. Second, an intelligent control plane. Enter Duck Lake. It's a lightweight relational SQL catalog that handles your schemas, snapshots, and file indexes. And third, on-demand vectorized compute. By using DuckDB, you get blazingly fast in-process analytical execution. And the best part, it only runs, and more importantly, only costs you money when a query is actually running. It's an incredibly efficient mental checklist for modern architecture.
All right, part three, solving the database requirement. Now you might be sitting there thinking, okay, but what about transactions and updates? It's a fair question. SAP has a very specific argument here. They claim you absolutely need a heavy database like HANA or DataSphere to handle things like micro-batch writes and complex document clearing. You know, like converting SAP open items into cleared items. Their stance is basically that doing this without a traditional database engine would be an absolute nightmare.
But here's the thing. Duck Lake actually solves those exact transactional needs natively right over cheap cloud storage. It uses a workflow called data inlining. The easiest way to think about this is like a waiting room for your data. Step 1, high-frequency micro-batch invoice updates come in and they're temporarily buffered as inline rows right inside the Duck Lake catalog. They just wait there, keeping everything nice and organized. Step 2, once that waiting room buffer hits a specific memory limit, let's say 64 megabytes, boom, it triggers step 3. All that data is automatically flushed out into one unified Parquet file on S3. So you get all the perks of microbatching without cluttering up your storage with thousands of tiny, messy files.
So the big takeaway here is that you maintain true native transactional capabilities over cloud storage. How does it manage clearing those invoices? With microsecond asset updates. It commits status changes just by updating row-level pointers inside the SQL catalog. That completely eliminates the need to do heavy, expensive rewrites of the underlying files. And what about auditing? It has snapshot time travel. So if your finance team calls up and says, hey, we need to see open line items exactly as they were on March 31st, the system handles it instantly through indexed snapshot lookups. It is a seriously deep, highly capable technical solution, and it requires absolutely zero proprietary database engines.
Which brings us to part 4, the architectural cost shift. It's time to pit Goliath against David. The contrast between these two architectures is just devastating. For storage, SAP locks you into proprietary HANA in-memory storage, which can easily run you tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars per terabyte. Duck Lake, commodity cloud storage. For metadata, SAP tightly couples you to the ABAP data dictionary. Duck Lake uses an open relational catalog like Postgres or SQLite. For compute, SAP demands these continuously running, high-cost clusters. Duck Lake uses in-process vectorized CPU execution that only fires up when you actually need it. And ecosystem? SAP is total vendor lock-in. The Duck Lake stack gives you open Parquet files, standard SQL, and the MIT license. It's just maximum flexibility across the board.
Let this number sink in for a second. About 20 bucks. That is roughly the cost per terabyte per month for commodity cloud storage like S3. Compare that $20 to the six-figure costs of proprietary in-memory storage. The sheer absurdity of paying those legacy premiums just to hold static analytical data becomes literally impossible to ignore when you see the numbers laid out like this.
That leads us nicely into part 5, the 85-15 reality check.
But wait, you're probably thinking, doesn't SAP handle massive global-scale data? Well, here is the aha moment. Our sources show that for about 85% of enterprises, their core SAP analytical datasets, things like financial ledgers, sales history, inventory, actually sit somewhere between 50 gigabytes and 5 terabytes. We call this medium data. It's only a tiny fraction, like 15%, that truly pushes into the massive petabyte-scale territory that might actually justify that incredibly complex distributed infrastructure.
So why exactly are you paying six-figure annual licensing fees for SAP Datasphere just to run everyday reports on a few terabytes of data? On the flip side, a single-node vectorized engine like DuckDB, and yes, it's an engine named after a duck, running on modern hardware, can query tens of millions of SAP rows in literal milliseconds, no massive cluster required. Paying for massive clusters to process 500 gigabytes of ledger data is, frankly, complete infrastructure over-engineering for the vast majority of what we do. Finally, part 6, SAP's last real defense.
So if the open source analytics layer is outperforming it this badly, why is SAP still dominating? Well, because SAP actually does hold a massive edge in the enterprise market, but it's not where you think it is. Their real moat is their proprietary extraction lock-in. Getting data out of the SAP ecosystem securely is famously painful. They lock you in through ODP queues, CDS views, and SLT extraction tools. The real challenge isn't analyzing the data once you have it. The challenge is getting those Delta updates out in the first place. But once you crack that code, you enter what we call the decoupled reality. If you can extract those SAP Delta updates using Change Data Capture, CDC, directly into standard Parquet files on cloud storage, SAP Datasphere instantly loses its biggest value proposition. By slotting Duck Lake in as your relational catalog over those Parquet files, you get all those transactional capabilities and microsecond query planning we discussed earlier. Solve the extraction piece, and monolithic data warehouses effectively become obsolete for most SAP analytical workloads. It's basically the ultimate cheat code to bypass vendor lock-in.
Which leaves us with one final, incredibly important question for you to chew on. If extraction is the only real moat SAP has left, are you currently considering a specific Change Data Capture framework to stream your Delta data out of SAP and into open Parquet files? Because once you map out that extraction strategy, the door to massive infrastructure savings and true open source agility is just wide open. Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer, and we'll catch you next time.